Hey guys, so in this video I'm going to do a long overdue tutorial. I actually started prepping this tutorial like a year and a half ago. I drew these eyes, printed them off on my marker paper, and then I just never did the tutorial, I guess. So I was like, hey, I have those papers kicking around still. I should just make this tutorial. So it's how to draw, or how to color eyes rather, with Copics. And I found 3 different methods that I thought were kind of cool. They're not all that different from each other, but I just thought I would go over each one with you. So we're going to start off with this one, which is usually what I do when I'm drawing the eyes a lot smaller. I pretty much never draw eyes this large when I'm doing a picture because it's usually at least waist up when I draw something. So I usually never draw the eyes this large in the first place. So this one's a little bit more simplistic looking because I usually use that technique on smaller eyes. And then the other 2 are a little more detailed. You kind of need a larger eye to get in that detail, so I'm just going to jump right in with the simple one first. So the colors I'm using for this eye are YR30 and Y06, and those are kind of the main colors. I usually pick the second lightest color as the main color, so I want a yellow eye, that's the Y06. I picked one slightly lighter, and then I picked some darker ones for shading. So there's also Y28, E47, E49, and 100. 100 is black, and I usually make all my eyes fade up to black. That's just a personal preference. You don't have to go that dark if you don't want to, but that's how I'm going to be doing these tutorials. So this one is basically a simple gradient from dark to light. And I usually start off with my main color, which was my second lightest, the Y06. And I'm going to make an outline of where the lightest color will go. It's kind of like a bean shape, like a long bean, kind of like macaroni noodle or something, I guess. And then I just bring that color up. And I'm going to move on to my next color. I'm basically going to work my way up, but I'm not going to do a ton of blending at this point. I'm just going to basically drop in the colors, and I'm going to use some flicking motions like this so that it's easier to blend. That was the Y28. Moving on to the E47. And usually if I'm drawing these eyes smaller, I don't actually use this many colors. I'll use maybe a total of 3 colors plus black for the pupil. But since I'm drawing this a bit larger, I'm going to use more colors. Here's the E49. And I'm going to make my way across the top. The top of the eye is typically the darkest because your eyelid and eyelashes are casting a shadow on the eye. I'm also going to go ahead and color in the entire pupil. Some people prefer to leave the pupils all black, or they actually make it lighter using other colors from the eye, but I like to have a lot of contrast in mine, so if it's really tiny, it's just black, but sometimes there's just a little bit of my darker color in the middle as well. So the last color in the gradient is the black. And I'm just going to go in and color the contour of the pupil. And now I'm going to start all the blending, so I'm going to take basically my darker brown and just work backwards from where I just was. Work my way back down the eye. If it's a smaller eye, I typically just don't have to blend this much. You basically just throw your colors down and you're almost good to go. And by small, I mean like quite tiny. Much, much tinier than this. Basically, the larger it is, more details you can get into it. So you have to experiment a little depending on the size of your eye. So now we're getting back down to the bottom portion of the eye, and I didn't draw in the lightest color yet, just, I don't know, that's just my preference. I don't do it that way. And I wait till last, and I just kind of brush across, and sometimes I do that because if the color got too dark, I go back and forth like this until the color is getting really wet, and well, the paper is getting really wet, and the color is pushing the darker colors away just to bring back some of that highlight, but I left enough so I don't really need to go back too much. And then the last bit of coloring, I'm taking my Y28 and just outlining the rim of the eye, because eyes usually do have a little bit of a border to them. Just filling in the color. Oh, and then one more thing you can do. If it's a really, really tiny eye, I normally would stop there, but I sometimes try to get in just a few lines just to add a bit of detail to the eye down here. And then all I gotta do is add the highlights. You can do this however you want. There's so many different ways to do eye highlights. I just do the very simple large one here, small one here, and then maybe use a really tiny paintbrush or a white gel pen to add more lines at the bottom. This one's so pale already, I might not really need much at the bottom, but I definitely want to get in the bigger highlights. So I'm using a paintbrush and some Copic Opaque white. And it's not the best paintbrush, but whatever. And I'm going to paint on the highlight. You could also, if you have some good quality whiteout that doesn't crack, you could use that as well, or some kind of opaque white paint. So that's all I'm going to do for the painting portion of it. And like I mentioned before, I'm going to take my white gel pen, and you might not even really see this, that's why it's kind of pointless when I'm using yellows, because it's so pale. But yeah, that is it for the basic gradient eye. So next we're going to move on to this more kind of detailed eye, and I'm doing red. And then using just a little bit of a very pale yellow just to add a bit of extra color. Up here I mostly just stuck to kind of the yellowy range, but as soon as you start mixing different color families, it starts to look really cool. So what makes this one different is I'm basically doing a lot of little lines like this, kind of like a bunch of little triangles poking inwards, and then there's a bunch poking outwards from the middle of the pupil. And it's just kind of a more detailed look. I almost wanted to say realistic. It's not a realistic eye, but it gives more of the realistic details of eyes, basically. So the way this one works is we're actually going to start with our darkest colors, which is black. So the 100 is black. I also included a little bit of BV29, which is just a really dark blue violet color, just because my red has a hard time blending into the black in the pupil. And then my main red is R35 and kind of R46. They're kind of both the main ones. And then R89 is my dark red that I'm using for just blending in with the black. And then the YR31 is the really pale yellow in the middle. So starting with that black, I'm just going to color in the pupil right away. And I'm just going to leave a little center bit for the red and the BV29. Coloring in the top. Now for the other one, I was blending downwards the whole time. This time we're going to be doing sideways motions. So I'm turning my paper to make it a little easier for me, just because for me when I'm flicking, it's easiest for me to flick upwards. And this is not going to work if you have a Copic original or any nib other than this really pointy brush nib, because you really need to get fine points. It's actually kind of hard, even on an eye this large. So it's actually easiest for me if I hold my marker almost vertical, but then you guys can't see what I'm doing. So I'm trying to hold it at a bit more of an angle. And I'm basically just going to make my around the eye and then do some smaller ones around the pupil. And the key with this is to not color too far with the black, because you're going to run out of room for your color. So try to just make super tiny lines. And right now it's pretty uniform, especially over in here. So what I'm going to do is make some longer lines, some long ones, some short ones, just for a bit of variety. And then towards the top, I'm going to do a lot of longer ones just so that the lighter area can blend into the darker area. And remember, you don't have to use red for this. You can basically use any colors you want, and it doesn't even have to fade out into black. It can fade out into any color, but that kind of ties into my next design, so I'll make it more colorful in the next eye. So, moving on to my darkest red, which is my R89. I'm gonna color in that pupil, but it doesn't blend very well, and that's my darkest red. So I'm taking that BV29 just to help it blend. That's really all the BV29 I use. It's actually a little bit paler than the other eye I did, so I'm going to add a bit more. That looks about good enough. And then I'm going to blend downwards with this, with the sideways motions. So at first I'm pretty much coloring in all the white with the red, and then I start to leave a few little white areas because that's where we want our lighter reds to go. And I'm not going to touch this bottom area down here because the bottom of the eye is where the highlights will catch, and that's where I'm going to put the majority of my yellow color. So I'm just going to add a bit of darkness, but not too much. So my next color is the, no, not that one, R46. The R46 is really not that different from the R35, so it's not that big of a deal. And basically with the reds, I'm going to be coloring it almost all the way. I'll leave a little bit of white, but my yellow is so pale, you might be thinking, well, how are you going to color the yellow on top of a dark color? And basically, I just have to lay down a lot of ink so that it removes some of the red color, leaving kind of a yellow mixed with red look. And you can also use the colorless blender for that as well. But for this specific eye, I thought it would look cool to add in some yellow, so I didn't go with a colorless blender. Alright, so I've got all the reds laid down and all the blacks. It's looking pretty evil right now. Oh my god. If you leave out the highlights, it'll definitely look like an evil eye. So, on to my lightest color, which is the YR31. I'm going to be doing some tiny motions. Again, this is easiest if you hold it straight up and use the very tip, but I'm trying to not cover what I'm doing. And you have to go over the same spot many, many times and slowly rub away the ink. But you have to be careful because if you put down too much ink, your colors will start bleeding everywhere. And you will notice that this does kind of muddy up your colors and makes the black fade as well as some of the red. So we will have to go back later and just kind of touch those up to make it look a bit more crisp. But right now we're just concerned with pulling away some of that red and exposing the yellow. There's just something that's different about doing it this way as opposed to just leaving the paper white then coloring yellow. Like, this just looks cooler, and I like this sort of watery, messy effect. I always call it like a tie-dye effect where the colors bleed together. I'm just going to work my way up the sides, but I don't want to go too high. I'll just add a little bit of this yellow color. And then, just because I want the bottom to really pop, I am going to take the colorless blender and just on the very bottommost part, remove some of the yellow even. And now is when we want to go back in with the reds. I'm going to take my R46 and just, oh, I kind of colored on top of the yellow. I'm trying to go between the yellow lines I made and just make them look less round. Make everything look more sharp. And I actually like to take my multi-liner at this point when I'm touching up the blacks because you can get finer lines and just get pointier little jaggedy things. Filling in some little holes that I left white as well. And I think I'm pretty satisfied with how that looks, so I'm going to go in and add the highlights. So once again, with the Copic Opaque white and a paintbrush, or whatever kind of white paint you're using, draw in the highlights. I'm just doing my same thing, my go-to big highlight in one spot. If the eyes I'm drawing are really tiny, I usually just do this one highlight, and that's it. But if I have space, I always try to get in both. And there's really no reasoning behind this. I mean, whenever you're going for kind of an anime style, the highlights don't always make sense. They're really not that realistic. So there's that. And then I'm going to go in with my gel pen. And when I'm doing the highlights here, I'm trying to stick to the yellow, but I don't want to cover up the yellow. So I'm going kind of where the yellow and the red lines meet. And just adding a few highlights. Just checking my consistency between eyes. Normally it's easier to be consistent if you draw them at the same time, but this is how I'm doing it. And so yeah, that is basically it for the second eye. So this next one's a little similar to the red one in terms of technique, but the main difference here is that we're not going for as dark of a look. So instead of doing these little black spikies around the middle, we're actually going to use our lightest color around the middle and just kind of make a cool effect, because a lot of eyes actually look like this. I was actually looking at some blue eyes and they faded to green in the middle, and I was like, man, that's so cool. Gotta include that in my tutorial. So my colors I'm using are, the main color is the BG05. I've got BG01 as a highlight, BG49 for shading, and then to add in a bit of the green, I'm using some YG06. And then as kind of a green highlight, I'm using Y06, which is actually a yellow, but it's a yellow-green, so I'm using a yellow as a highlight. And then there's B39 for the shadows, and then, or like the deepest shadows, and then 100 black for the pupil, and then upper shadow. So, we are going to start actually with the green. I would like to start with the pupil. That's kind of my instinct. That's what I usually do, is kind of color in the pupil. But if you're using a light color, it's going to pull the dark color out of the pupil when you're using your lighter color. So it's just going to pull the dark ink out, and that's not what we want. So I'm going to start with the green and work my way around the pupil. So again, with the flicking motions, and it doesn't matter if you get too much of this, because this is the lightest color, you can easily just color over it. And you want it to be a little bit irregular. So there's kind of patches where there's not as much, some patches where there's more, etc. And I'm trying to keep the bulk of the green towards the bottom. Then I'm going to switch it up to my darkest color other than black, which is my B39. I'm going to rim the outside of the eye before I do my spikes, just to make sure there's no white gaps. And once again, I'm going to have to carefully do the flicking motions without getting too much. The key is you don't want to get too far with it, because the black actually went pretty far in. With this one, I'm trying to just do the very, very edges. And then once I get to the top, I'm going to be coloring in the top as well as the pupil. Next, I'm going to take my black and just kind of finish off the pupil, because it bothers me when it's unfinished. I like to get the pupil done as soon as possible, usually. And added the darkest shadow. And then go back with the blue and blend it out. So now we're going to use our blues to fill in the middle. And I don't actually use much of the BG01. Most of it is the BG05 and the BG49. The only difference is when I get to the bottom, I try to use less of the BG49 because it's the darkest, and I try to switch to using more of the BG01 just for that bit of extra highlight at the bottom. So, going with the BG49. The order's not that crucial. It's just kind of what I feel like doing. And using the flicky motions, I'm going to color this in. And some of it's going to almost go kind of all the way across and touch the pupil, but as I get down here, I'm not going to touch the pupil. And again, vary your lengths to kind of make it look interesting. Now that I'm at the bottom, try to use this color sparingly. And use it more as I get back up the side. Now switching to my BG05, which is the one I said I consider my main color. And we're going to blend in with the green. And taking the BG01, just kind of blending things out. It's the lightest color, so it's not really darkening at all, just kind of filling in gaps. So that is basically it for this, other than the highlights, but I am going to add in a bit of that yellow like I mentioned, and just kind of brighten up the bottom a little. And since this is a light color, it is washing out my darks. So basically at this point, the main color is done. It's all about just fixing it up, adding a bit of extra detail here and there. Blending it all out. Well, like really, it's weird because you want to blend from one color to the next in a way, but with the green having the least amount of blending. But you don't want to blend across because you want to see all those lines. You want to see the stringiness of the eye, the kind of horizontal here and then vertical here, because that is what is adding all the detail. So I think that is good enough, and I'm going to switch to doing the highlights. Once again, Copic Opaque White, nothing new. Bloop, bloop, bloop. Okay, don't get too fast now. It's going terrible. Normally I would spend a little bit more time making sure it's perfect. Well, as close to perfect as I can get. And I just, they're not necessarily supposed to match perfectly, but if this was a face, I would want it to match. So if this one's big, I want this one to be big too. Okay, now, last but not least, using the gel pen. This is, by the way, a Sakura jelly roll. Bought it at Michael's. It's like $3 or $2 or something. Adding in a bit of the highlights. Again, concentrating it most towards the bottom because that's where most of the highlights normally are on the eye. Well, not highlights, but the color is lighter there. And this is not really meant to be a highlight. It's meant to just be lightening it. Not like one of these big fancy lights. So here are the 3 eyes again, all finished. Ah, they look so lovely when they're in pairs. I think this one's my favorite just because of the colors I used, although I really like the darkness of this one too. Let me know which one you guys like the best. And yeah, try these out with different colors. There's even more techniques in this. These are just kind of the techniques I use for eyes, so that's what I thought I would share. So I hope you guys like this tutorial, and thanks for watching.